Hello everyone, my name is David Pirtle, and that's my colleague Steve Thomas, and we are from the National Coalition for the Homeless, which is the nation's oldest advocacy organization that works on behalf of and in cooperation with people who are currently or have experienced homelessness. We work on the issues of housing, wages, healthcare, and civil rights, which are all extremely important. But we also do a lot of public education programs, and Steve and I are part of the Faces of Homelessness Speakers Bureau, which speaks to about 10,000 young people every year and tries to put a human face on the issue of homelessness. Because when we think about homelessness, we usually think about a number of stereotypes. Now I'm going to mention some stereotypes, and I want you guys to raise your hands and let me know which of you have heard of this stereotype. Not necessarily that you believe it, but you've heard people say it before. That homeless people are lazy. That homeless people are drunk or addicted to drugs. That they are crazy. That they choose to be homeless. That they are all men. That they are predominantly minorities. That they are, predominantly my age or Steve's age as opposed to young people. And there's a lot of different stereotypes about homelessness, and you can find homeless people who fit every single stereotype. So we're not here to say that no one is this or that or the other. We're trying to say that there's more to this population than a collection of stereotypes. Like, for example, in this region, a lot of people associate homelessness with minorities, but really, homelessness is a problem of poverty. So whoever's poor in a community, those are the people who are going to be more likely to make up the homeless population. So here in Washington, since the population is primarily minority and the poor population is primarily minority, the homeless population is primarily minority. Where I'm from, in Arizona, whose poor is primarily Latinos and Native Americans. So the homeless population is primarily Latinos and Native Americans. I spoke up in Portland, Oregon, and the poor population is primarily white. And so the homeless population is 97.5% white. So it really has nothing to do with race. It has to do with who doesn't have enough money to afford a place to live. Another thing that I mentioned is age. You know, when people think of homelessness, they think of single men and middle-aged men, because that's what they see on a street corner with a sign, or hanging out in the park. In actuality, single men make up less than half of the homeless population, and it's much less than half here in PG County. Over half of the population of PG County's homeless men and women are men and women in families with children. 54% of the homeless people in PG County are families with children. In the metropolitan DC area, it's only a little bit less than that. It's like 48% are families with children, according to the point-in-time count they did in January. So our perceptions of homelessness really have more to do with what we've heard, or even what we've seen, on a street corner, as opposed to the reality. Because the reality is that homelessness is a huge problem, and those people that we see in the park, or those people we see on the street corners in DC, are just the tip of the iceberg. They're the small number of people who are homeless, who have gotten to the point, they've been out there for so long, that they're unable to keep you from realizing they're homeless. Because most people who are homeless, you would never know they were. They don't want you to know they are, because the way that people treat homeless people and the stigma that's attached to homelessness. I want to ask you guys a couple more questions before we get started. How many of you have volunteered at a soup kitchen, or a food bank, or a shelter, or a service center before? Some of you? Excellent. How many of you know someone who's experienced homelessness in your personal life? Some of you? Yeah, it's unfortunately more common than ever before. But that's why we do what we do, because we're never going to end this problem until we raise awareness about who these people really are, that they're not bad people, they're just people who don't have a place to live. And we do that by telling our own stories. So I'm going to tell my story, and then I'm going to turn it over to Steve. He's going to share his. And then at the end, we're going to try to open it up for any questions that you might have. And you can ask us questions about ourselves, or about the National Coalition for the Homeless, or about homelessness in general. Around the country or here in DC, we can answer all of your questions. So just be thinking about what you want to ask while we're giving our presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and start with my story. My story begins, like I said, I'm from Arizona. You guys ever been to Arizona? Just show of hands, anybody's ever been to Arizona? One or just a couple of people? For one thing, it's hot, you know, and they say it's a dry heat, but wet or dry, it doesn't matter. 120 degrees is 120 degrees. It is hot. It gets hot in Arizona. And we don't really think about heat when it comes to homelessness. We worry about the cold. You know, that's why we have Hunger and Homelessness Awareness Week in November. You know, it's the week before Thanksgiving, because we want people to start thinking about doing coat drives and blanket drives, all those sorts of things. But the heat is just as dangerous for people who are homeless, because there aren't as many people out there in the summertime passing out bottles of water to make sure that people stay hydrated, or opening up cooling centers where folks can come in out of the heat. The heat is just as deadly as the cold. And, you know, you can always put more clothes on. You can only take so much off, you know, legally anyway. So the heat is very dangerous. Another reason that it's no fun to be homeless in Phoenix is they have a lot of laws that target homeless people. They call it criminalizing homelessness. Have you guys ever heard the term criminalizing homelessness? It's like cities get so frustrated with the number of people who are homeless that they make it illegal to do certain things in the hopes that they'll make the homeless people go away somehow, even though homeless people don't have anywhere to go. If they did, they wouldn't be homeless. And so they'll make it illegal to sleep outside, which is what they did in Phoenix, although there weren't enough places to sleep inside. So people would just get arrested for being homeless. They also, in the neighboring city, Tempe, they made it illegal to sit outside, because they were worried that homeless people would come from Phoenix to Tempe because they couldn't sleep outside. So they tried to one-up each other. There are actually cities in this country where it's illegal to pass out food to people who are homeless on the street or in parks, either entirely, or maybe you can only pass out so much food. And the reason they have these laws is because they don't like seeing homeless people congregating in public. They want homelessness to be a hidden problem. You know, and they like to say that if you pass out food to someone who's homeless, you're enabling them to be homeless, which I think is the silliest argument in the world, because I didn't become homeless for the food. You know, as nice, as appreciative as I was whenever someone handed something out to me, that's not the reason I ended up on the street, and if it wasn't available, that wouldn't have gotten me off the street. A lot of people who are homeless for very complex reasons that have nothing to do with just wanting a free meal. And if that meal isn't available, that's why they turn to eating out of trash cans. So when you are passing out food to someone who's homeless, what you're really enabling them to do is to not have to eat garbage. So please, if you've done it before, keep doing it. If you haven't done it before, do it. Now, like I said, I became homeless in Phoenix, and that happened in 2004. And the reason that it happened is that I have a mental illness called schizophrenia. Anyone ever heard of schizophrenia? It's actually, unfortunately, a common illness. It affects about 1 out of every 100 people. Usually starts when you guys are you guys' age. It starts in your early teens and into your early 20s. They used to call it dementia precox, because it's like a type of dementia that affects young people. It can cause you to hear voices. It can cause you to believe things that aren't true, you know, have delusional thoughts. It can cause you to become very paranoid about your friends or your family or your neighbors or your coworkers. It can cause you to isolate yourself from other people and shut down and become almost catatonic. And it's extremely debilitating, because usually when it starts to affect people, they don't realize they're sick. You know, that they they know that they're hearing voices, they know that they're having these crazy thoughts, but they don't realize that means that there's anything wrong with them. And so they are often resistant to getting treatment early on. And so if they don't have good medical attention, doctors who they see regularly, who can recommend that they go to see a psychiatrist or whatever early on, then it's very easy for them to get lost in that world of dementia and hallucinations, and eventually they cease to function. And that's why it's so easy for people with schizophrenia to end up on the street. It started to affect me in my 20s, and by the time I was 29, I got to the point where I couldn't hold down a job anymore, so I lost my house and my apartment, and I ended up on the street. And like I said, because Phoenix is not a very nice place to be homeless, or at least wasn't back then in 2004, I decided that I would leave. And so I hopped on a train, and sometimes people ask me, how could you afford a train ticket if you were homeless? And I say, no, I hopped on a train, as it was going by. I grew up in the country where we didn't have anything to do but hop on trains and tip over cows. That's what we did for fun. So it wasn't anything new to me. So I hopped on a train, and I did a lot of hitchhiking, and I did a lot of walking, and occasionally I was driven from one county line to the next county line by a helpful officer of the law. Because unfortunately, in most of rural America, there are no services for people who are homeless. And that's led to another misconception, which is that homelessness is only a problem in the city. We don't see it in rural communities or suburban communities. The reason we don't see it is because there aren't any services in those communities, or not enough services. So people who become homeless in those communities, they go to the nearest city where they can find help. And so that's why we see homelessness more in the cities, but it is a problem everywhere. And while I was traveling across the country, there was no community I went to where I didn't see homeless people. Although it's weird, because before I became homeless, I didn't see homeless people at all. And we have so many homeless people in this country now. Hundreds of thousands of people at any one time. 3.5 million people over the course of any given year who experience homelessness, that paradoxically, it's become invisible to us. We don't even notice it any more than we notice a mailbox or a tree. We just walk oblivious down the street. Unless someone's asking us for money, and in which case we try to actively ignore that because we don't want to deal with that. And so, we just don't notice it. But once you become homeless, then it's hard to miss everywhere you go. Eventually, I ended up in New York City after a couple of months. And show of hands, how many of you guys have been to New York City? A lot of you. Excellent. It was my first time in the city. I was at the Port Authority. And sitting there on my first day, trying to figure out what the heck I'm going to do. And this was really the first time that I realized that I was homeless, even though I'd been homeless for a couple of months up to that point, because before then I was just traveling, I didn't really think of myself as one of those homeless people. I was just traveling. And I think that a lot of people who are homeless, when they first become homeless, they kind of delude themselves like that, because we are full of those terrible stereotypes about people, and we like to think of homeless people as, some other group that has something wrong with them that we can't be a part of. When unfortunately the fact is that there are millions and millions of people in this country that are on the threshold of becoming homeless, even though they're in denial. I'm sure you've heard this expression, people are...
Good morning, teachers. At this time, please turn on your televisions for the morning announcements. Thank you.
I'm sure you've heard this expression that people are 2 paychecks away from becoming homeless. Because people don't have any savings. So if they lose their job, after a month, maybe 2 months, there's no more rent, and they're out on their keisters. So I didn't really think of myself as a homeless person until I got to New York City, and I was sitting at the Port Authority, and I was looking around at all these other people sitting at the Port Authority who weren't waiting for a bus either, They were all just homeless like me. And it was a kid, actually, like a 15-year-old, who actually came up to me and said, you know, you don't look like you know what the hell you're doing. So he decided to show me the ropes of surviving on the street in New York. And unfortunately, there are thousands of kids, you guys' age, in New York City, unaccompanied. They're not with their families, they're just by themselves in the New York City area. And they can't get into a family shelter because they're not with their family. And either they can't get into an adult shelter or they don't want to because adult shelters are pretty nasty places, especially for kids to be. But there's only 200 shelter beds for people that age, for unaccompanied minors that age in New York City. So there are thousands of folks who have absolutely nowhere to go. But this kid, he really knew his way around the city, so he showed me where